Well, look at this cute little piano. Doesn't take up any room at all. No, it won't fall on me. No. But I could try to roll it over here, I guess. Well, it's interesting. The sermon today kind of goes along with some of the themes that are at this point where we are. So where we are is still in, we're still in Genesis. And in the 32nd chapter, where we have gotten Jacob has left Laban, and he's wandering on his way to go meet Esau, and we have him very anxious about that. He sent some folks out there to meet Esau, and they've come back and says, well, Esau is on his way with 400 men, and then Jacob is quite frightened and afraid and distressed. And but back in the 13th verse, after this long prayer, then we spent time talking about prayer last week. In the 13th verse, it says, "So he spent the night there." Now he's spending the night there. And so we have that expression of what time it is. And then he says, from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau. 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milk camels, and their colts, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, 10 male donkeys. These he delivered into the hands of his servants, and every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me. So he's sending them out, and it's still night, so it seems. And then we get past all of this, and he gives them instructions of what to say to Esau, for he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent that night in the camp. Okay, that's down on verse 21. And then it says, and the same night he got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And then he took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him. Then he said, and this is the he meaning the man, or whatever he is wrestling with, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, he meaning the other guy, what is your name? And then he said, and he said Jacob, so it was Jacob said Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him, well, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, which is spelled differently, and it's a place, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat of the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Now, chapter 33. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, and 400 men with him. Now, if we go back to verse 21, and where it's, he sent all these animals in different groups ahead of him, hoping that Esau will accept him if he receives these presents. And then 21, so the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent that night in the camp. And now Jacob looked up, and he saw Esau coming in 400 with him. So this part about the wrestling match seems to be inserted between verse 21 and the beginning of 33. And then he goes on, and he's dividing among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He puts the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. So he's doing a different kind of division than we have up here in the section before, which again shows a duplication that's different, but indicates that the section from 22 to the end of the chapter is an insertion into the story from another source. Anyway, he himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. Now, here, and again, here's a switcheroo. Before he'd sent everybody ahead of him, and now this time he goes first, and they're following. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." And then the maids drew near, and they and their children, and they bowed down. Likewise, Leah likewise, and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. And Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" And Jacob answered, "To find favor with my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor." And here we've got a play on the words face, in the sense that I have seen God face to face, and yet I live. Now I see Esau face to face, and now I live. He did not kill me, since you received me with such favor. Please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything I want. So he urged him, and he took it. And then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside." Anyway, so they go on from there. So this night wrestling story is a very, very important story in the Hebrew tradition and within all of the Old Testament, and people make a whole lot out of it, but it's really kind of crazy to make much sense out of it, since as Von Rod explains, this is an old story that's been reworked several times, and it has some early antecedents where it looks like they picked up some other stories and used the storyline in order to make some statements about Jacob and his importance as a patriarch. And in its final form in our text, it has these vestiges of the older traditions still hanging on, but it has a new message and meaning that the redactor wants the audience for Genesis to hear and understand. But as I had mentioned before, a lot of these biblical writers of the time felt like the materials they were working with were sacred texts, and that they didn't have the right to manipulate them and change them around in order to fit their agenda too much. They kind of had to leave them out of respect for their being inspired by God at an earlier time. But when they have a new situation and a new message, if you're using the old verbiage and language and parts of those stories, it confuses your new message and confuses us and biblical scholars and so forth because of a lot of ambiguities that are carried along with it. But von Rad is a German scholar, and he says this version that we have here is the work of the Yahwist, which means the redactor kind of picked up that one and inserted it into this story, and he may have chosen not to use some other stories that were still available. And even though things are being written down, the oral tradition is still alive and going on as well. They're kind of parallel, so they can be drawing some of the resources from both written and oral. Now, from 22:13, he spent the night there, and then it says he sent all these animals and camels and whatnot. And we also have the understanding that point of the crossing of the Jabbok is in a deep ravine. They've got great big wall, sort of like Grand Canyon. Not quite that big, but this river is cut deeply. It's not like our river out here and the South Canadian and all, where it's just all sandy and it isn't very deep and it's just slow and meandering. This is kind of a fast-running river that has cut deeply. And so we have this understanding that maybe it was a drier time of year and it wasn't flowing so rapidly like when we experience here the spring rains. The Illinois River is really full, and they warn people don't go floating the Illinois right now. It's, you get hung up in the trees and you flip over and you'll drown and so forth. It's dangerous. So maybe it was a drier time of year, and it wasn't so treacherous at that time. And then the other part is, why not go somewhere else where it's an easier crossing? But I got to thinking, well, maybe even though it's deep, it may be just a short swim. If you get to where it spreads out, it may be a more difficult crossing than, even though it's a little swift, but yet maybe it's a short distance across at that point. Anyway, von Rad also mentions that Dinah is left out of this list of children, but he didn't give any explanation. However, the scholar Vaughter suggests that some of the ancient authors didn't think the females or the girls were that important, so it's no big deal not to mention them because she's not going to be one of the tribes later on, so she doesn't need to be mentioned. Maybe why she's left out. But the fact that later she's raped by Shechem and there's a big deal about that in the story, it seems kind of odd that she's not mentioned there, which could only, or not only, but probably mean that the Yahwist part of that story does not know about the rape story and all of that. That may be another tradition that wasn't part of his sources. But anyway, back to this great nighttime struggle, wrestling match, the fight with a stranger. It says a man, but is it a man? We can't really see. It's dark. Is it a divine being, an angel? Is it a demon? Is it God? Or is it only a nightmare that seems so real? And when he jumped out of bed, he twisted his hip. But anyway, we're told that Jacob has superhuman strength to fight all night and to be winning. And does the adversary fight dirty and unfairly? If Jacob is winning, how come the adversary can put his hip out of joint? I know in wrestling there are certain things that are, I wasn't a wrestler. I was a basketball player and track, but anyway, I know there's some things that, are some moves and some holds that you can pull somebody's arm out of joint and do some things, and that's, you can win, you can whoop them if it's a street fight, but on the mat in the official wrestling match, you can't do some of those things. But anyway, he dislocated Jacob's hip. And then it makes me wonder, how does Jacob hang on with the pain in his dislocated hip? How does he keep up? Now, as I was working with this, I had an experience. We're supposed to host a Halloween party for Bobby's 18th birthday. It's Friday. He wanted to do that. So we've got to clean the yard, clean the house, get 6 or 8 or 10 big plastic boxes of all of Karen's Halloween stuff out of the attic. And so Bobby was up there and he was handing them down, and somehow the second one was pretty heavy and I got it, and when I was turning, we have this little curb from where the ladder was to, and I don't know how I did it. All I know is I got that box, and the next thing I know, I was falling, and my right foot was under me, and I was down. I couldn't catch myself, and my toes were hyperextending, and I twisted my knee, and I fell, and I sat on some other boxes so I didn't fall and hit the floor and break anything. But my toes and my knee were traumatized, and I had to tell Bobby, get out of the attic and come pull me up so I can assess whether I'm injured badly or this is going to pass. So anyway, he pulled me up, and then it took a while for the initial pain to subside and kind of work it out a little bit. But if, your hip is pulled out of the socket, how do you have the wherewithal to not be in such excruciating pain that you can still hold on? Who knows? Who knows? But anyway, Von Rad suggests that ancient sagas and folk tales from the ancient cultures have these stories of gods and spirits and demons who attack men at night, and part of their secret powers are that they're hidden in the dark. But the men in the stories extort something from the attacker if they're strong and prevail. Then they either draw some strength or some special gift or power from the attacker. That's part of the folk story of how come the hero is so strong or extra abilities. Well, he won this battle with the demon or the god or the spirit at some place because he exacted the blessing from that person. But this story of Jacob sounds a little bit like this type of story, and maybe it was in an earlier phase, or it was borrowed as a type to try to carry another message. But the spirit or the demon or the god only has power at night, so when dawn is coming, it has to give up the fight and retreat. And therefore, let me go! I've got to slither back under the rocks, or I'll melt, sort of like the wicked witch of the north. If the light shines on me. But anyway, this element has stayed with the story, even though no Israelite hearing the story at the time the Genesis had been written and being read to the people, no Israelite would have believed that God or an angel of God would be limited that way. But yet, like I said, some of these elements of the story just kind of keep being repeated. And a part of that is also the culture of the listener, that sometimes you have to tell stories in ways that have a hook with the listener so that they will accept the part that you want them to accept, but you kind of have to give in a little bit and go with some things. I've been listening to some lectures about the history of religion and how religion as a study has developed over the years. And an interesting thing that just heard this last week on one of the lectures is that in ancient cultures, there was a sky god and an earth goddess. As people understood life, everything comes in pairs, male and female, in the animal world and the plant world and so forth. And they learned that reality has this dynamic, and so why not the gods? And so the sky god, they're being taught about Yahweh, the creator, the sky god, but yet it just doesn't make sense to the people that there's not an earth mother. And so they kind of allow them in their development, okay, we'll let you keep believing in an earth mother, but you've got to know these things about Yahweh is really not your old sky god, but this is a new revelation, a new understanding. This is what I want you to know. And if you want to keep believing in Earth Mother, that's okay, because the earth is like a mother, Anyway, so some of those elements keep being allowed to be in the stories for the sake of the listener. And it's not the main message of the ones telling the story. They've got a different message. But so the people won't stop listening, they kind of allow that to be there for them. Anyway, so it's interesting that Jacob tricked Isaac to get a blessing, and at his birth he was clutching Esau's heel. And remember, Dr. Power at SMU, in his rendition of the Genesis stories, would call Jacob Grabby. He gave him the nickname Grabby. And so here again, he's holding on. He's trying to gain a blessing. But to think his adversary could give him a blessing implies that Jacob is realizing the adversary is divine. Demons don't give blessings. Strangers who attack you in the night to rob you or whatever they're doing, they don't give blessings. So the understanding that if he's asking for a blessing at this point, Jacob is recognizing this is a divine being with whom I'm wrestling in the dark. But instead of a blessing, he's given a new name, Israel. Now Jacob then, after that just kind of doesn't faze him, just seems to go right by, but then he wants to ask his assailant, what is your name? And the assailant responds, why is it that you ask my name? And he doesn't give him a name, he just kind of goes on. But that question is an important question. A lot of times questions that are put forth, it's a rhetorical question that's not answered in the text, but for the listener, wants the listener to ask that, or let's stop. Sort of like if you read some books and you get at the end of the chapter, there are discussion questions. So it's maybe like that. So why indeed? There is power and significance in a name and in knowing another's name. And part of Trevor's sermon at the early service, and will be repeated at second service, is an understanding of blessing. And in the whole context of blessing, it's a presence and paying attention to people, and then knowing their name. Getting to know their name is a part of getting to know them and spending enough time to learn the name. Anyway, in this situation, the assailant could have been a local god or a spirit. For example, some of the ancient people believed that there were river gods who had power over life and death of those who tried to cross them. Sometimes they allow you to get across, and sometimes they would suck you under and drown you. And so if you want to have a successful crossing, then it's good to pray to the river god, or offer gifts to the river god, or burn incense, or do something to make the river god realize you respect this god and you're asking for a favor or a blessing. So anyway, so maybe this was the origin of toll roads. If you're going to have a safe crossing, pay a toll, pay a gift in order to get there safely. Otherwise, we'll pull you over with the flashing lights and give you a ticket or something. Anyway, but getting the name, then if you know the name, you know with whom you are contending or dealing. And if that god or demon or old troll under the bridge or whatever, you know their character, you know what they might want or need from you, or you may know their powers, and now you know their name, you can call upon them. You have their name, you've got some control over them. And then you can make them give you what you want from them, which could be safe crossing or some other kind of gift or blessing or favor. Now, in that sense, it's a concept of religion and with gods and the people. Sometimes the offerings, the sacrifice, people understand that if I do all that is required on my side, then you, God, owe me. You have to fulfill your side of the bargain because I fulfilled my side of the bargain. Now, this is where we get into crossing out of religion into the superstition and the magic. I've said the right words, I've given the incantation, and now I've got the magical powers at work. So this one-to-one relationship is a part of the religious world or arena. We understand and have come to understand we don't control God. We can't say the magic words. We can't offer certain things. We can't do the good deeds, the good works, and or be in church every Sunday, and therefore God will give us perfect health and won't make us a victim to the bad people. We hope it'll be better for us, but we don't have the one-to-one, 100% control aspect that some people want and believe that sometimes they can do that. That's why I was called to visit someone in the hospital a while back. Wasn't a member of our church, but was a neighbor of one of our members, and this person was really had a bad situation, and his young man who had some disabilities from birth and now just been diagnosed with cancer, and his dad was so angry at God that after his son had suffered all this, then now he's got this. But it was from a tradition that has more of a one-to-one, or more of the Old Testament holiness code. If you're bad and do bad things, then God will punish you and make bad things happen. If you are good and do good things, then God will reward you and bless you, and bad stuff will not happen. Now, if you got that kind of theology happening, when some bad stuff comes that you don't deserve, then, well, God, you didn't keep your bargain. I kept my bargain, but you didn't keep your bargain. All right, I'm mad at you, and I won't believe in you anymore. And so the dad was processing those feelings. And so it was something he's struggling with to work through. Anyway, he could not receive, let's see. Oh, in Jacob's case, this is different, for he is contending against Yahweh or an angel of Yahweh. And even in an earlier form, the story was about if it's a demon or a river god. But this story is really about Jacob wants us to know that he was struggling with God, that he could not receive a blessing in his old condition and his former nature. So the assailant, ignoring his name or his demand for a blessing, but then asks for his name, and he answers Jacob. And then the assailant says, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed." So Jacob asked for, in return, well, what's your name? And why is it that you want to ask my name? And there he blessed him. So the one he's dealing with really maintains control over the conversation. Jacob asks for a blessing. He doesn't get an immediate blessing. Jacob asks for a name. He doesn't get a name. But then after he has received a new name and therefore a new identity, then he gets a blessing. And it didn't say what the blessing is. It just, he gets a blessing. Von Rad suggests that Jacob's stolen blessing was not a legitimate blessing when he stole Esau's blessing. And now he has received a legitimate blessing after his ordeal, after his trial in the wrestling match. Now the sun comes up, but Jacob emerges from the struggle broken and wounded. Maybe an earlier etiology, or how things came to be, for a cultic dance. At a worship center someplace, they had a dance where it's like they're limping. And so, well, why do you dance that way? Well, it goes all the way back to Jacob when he wrestled with an angel at night. His hip was out of socket. And so to remember that, our dance at the worship center is a limping dance. Anyway, no proof of that. That's just a speculation. And then the thigh muscle is something that is not eaten. That a lot of cultic places, certain things were taboo, and for different reasons they get to be taboo. Sometimes that's parts given to the priest. Lay people can't eat that. This is a way to support the priesthood. But anyway, there are a lot of things that have some reason that's lost to us now. But anyway, Von Rad says that the meaning could be an inward purification of Jacob. And it also has an element that the patriarch represents the whole people and their national experience from time to time with their God. There is a life and death struggle over long periods until the breaking of a new day. And the people may go forth wounded and diminished like they had when they came out of Egypt. They had suffered and lost a lot, and they had contended with the Pharaoh, but also, God, why aren't you rescuing us? Why are you holding out? So there was this contention or struggle that where Jacob represents the people. Well, Bruce Vaughter sees the meaning is to be found in verse 29. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have contended with the divine and human beings and have prevailed. And the limp is a sign of a changed man. And again, not that the relationship with God that is faithful is not passivity, rejoicing in one's election while waiting on providence, but rather a wrestling with the divine will and purpose and a sense of identity amidst the real-life situations for questions of justice and mercy is what Vaughter thinks is a part of that. And then Nahum and Sarna It's an older book, but he's a Jewish scholar who's written a commentary on Genesis. And his commentary suggests that the assailant is meant to be an angelic figure from an earlier strata of the story, but it's different from the pagan pantheon. And he wants to do a little education about angelology and ideas about angels as compared to other gods, because at different times angels take on more of a whole theology in themselves, and they become kind of demigods or lesser gods. They really aren't one God and people, but these angels in the middle, and archangels and regular angels, and how many angels on a pinhead, and so forth, that Sarna is trying to do a little explaining about the differences. And he suggests that in the pagan pantheon, the gods have personalities, and they have names, and they have special powers, they have special characteristics. But angels have no definable personalities, and they pursue no independent existence. They are both nameless and characterless, and they vanish as suddenly as they appear. So, I don't know how, the science fiction movies, it's kind of like God is up in heaven and God sends a hologram that interacts with people, and the people think, well, it's an angel. And then the hologram disappears, but it was the presence of God and God's will and God's communication with the human being. And so they called that image or that experience being visited by an angel. And then another one in angelology, looking at the traditions and how they developed, was a circumlocution, which means to talk around. And what it means is someone experienced the divine presence, but in their humility, I, as a human being, am not worthy to have God come to me personally. But I had an experience. So God must have sent a messenger, an angel. But God didn't come God's self. So this is a way of being humble. I won't say that, well, God told me what to do. And I've had, there's a situation once where someone had told me that God had told them to do something, in their prayers. And I really didn't quite agree with that. But how can I argue against God? If they claim God had told them this, so there's really no way to engage in a conversation or discussion if you are at different places, because you can't argue with God. God knows everything. God's all-powerful. But if it was stated in a different way, I get the feeling, I'm sensing, I'm wondering if maybe God is calling me or wanting me or whatever, but to just, God told me this, God told me, that's it. Discussion ended, no argument. So the circumlocution about angels sometimes is a way to be humble and not presumptuous. Anyway, he says another significance about the change in name is that it portends a new destiny. It's a break with the past, and it begins a new role. Now we have that, I guess, in marriage. In our culture, usually the woman gives up her maiden name and takes on her husband's name. whether that's right or wrong or whatever, it's the cultural tradition, but it signifies a change in status and role. No longer is she daddy's little princess. She's somebody else's spouse, partner. And that becomes her primary relationship and loyalty. Huge change. And in some families, great strife because family members don't accept and recognize that change in loyalty. But the change in the name is a signification. There's a big change in identity and relationship and function in the life of the world and the community. Rabbi Sachs has some wonderful, interesting thoughts that he has from the Jewish people's perspective. And one of them, he says, for the sages in Bereshit Rabbah 77:3, cited in Rashi to 32:24, that this angel was a guardian angel for Esau. The rabbis had got to wondering and thinking and arguing and debating, and someone came up with that idea. But then he goes, the next sentence is, Jacob himself had no doubt. It was God. It wasn't a guardian angel for Esau who was sent ahead to whoop up on Jacob. Anyway, he called the encounter Peniel because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The adversary himself implies as much when he gives Jacob the name of Israel, for you have struggled with God and with man and have overcome or prevailed. Hitherto we have seen Jacob struggle with human beings, with Esau and Laban, and now the text suggests he struggles with God himself. Now the passage, he says, resist easy interpretation, yet it holds a key to understanding Jewish identity. It is not we, the readers, who give this significance, but Torah itself. And he says, names in Torah, especially a new name given by God, are not mere labels, but signals of character or calling. I mean, it is really important. We're going to hear the scripture this morning of Jesus' baptism and the voice from heaven, you are my son, in whom I am well pleased. He's given name or identity in that communication, Jesus is. So, he says, to be sure, our ancestors were later called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, but we never lost that earlier appellation. You are the people who struggle with God and with man and yet survived. And what does that mean? And so he goes on to develop this, and he says, when Esau finally appears, all the fears that Jacob had before turned out to be unfounded. He runs to meet Jacob, throws his arms around his neck, kisses him, and weeps. And there's no anger or animosity or threat of revenge. This is not to say that Jacob's fears were irrational. They were not. After all, Esau had vowed 22 years ago to kill him. Although Esau, if we remember his character, he was a very impulsive man who lives in the mood of the moment. And so the anticlimax when the brothers meet is consistent with Esau's character, but not Jacob's fears. But more consequential and unexpected is Jacob's behavior when the brothers meet. First, he bowed down to the ground 7 times, prostrating himself before Esau. Each of his family members does likewise. Then the maidservants approached, and their children, and they bowed themselves. Next, Leah and her children come and bowed themselves. And Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed themselves. This threefold repetition is significant. No less striking is Jacob's use of the language. 5 times he calls Esau Adonai, or my Lord. In the previous chapter, he tells his servants 3 times to use the name Adonai to Esau, and twice himself he calls Esau's Eved himself his servant. Anyway, it goes on and on and on about this self-abasement. Now, how are we to connect this with the wrestling match of the previous night? Surely Jacob had won a victory over his adversary. At the very least, he refused to let him go until he received the blessing. And then the new name implied that henceforth Jacob should have no doubts about his ability to survive any conflict. So why doesn't he have a sense of arrogance and a sense of power? Why is he so self-effacing? A man who wrestled with God and with men and has overcome is not one who needs to bow down to anyone or call him my Lord. Well, we should have expected Jacob to show newfound confidence rather than this wholly servile kind of posture. Perhaps the answer lies in Jacob's words on the first meeting. Esau at first refuses Jacob's gift, saying, "I have plenty, my brother. Let what is yours be yours." But Jacob's reply is enigmatic, hearkening back to the mysterious struggle of the previous night while raising yet more questions. "No, please. If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from my hand, for to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." Again, like I mentioned earlier, he sees the face of God and survives. He lives. He is not killed. Please accept this present, and this Berk Haiti, literally, please accept my blessing. Not a present, but a blessing if you use a different translation. That was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have everything. Why has the gift become a blessing? In what conceivable way is seeing the face of Esau like seeing the face of God? And what exactly does Jacob mean by altering Esau's words, "I have plenty," into his own, "I have everything"? If we could understand these words, perhaps we could understand the link between the wrestling match and the subsequent meeting. I will have you waiting upon bated breath for the answer next Sunday. I thought, anyway, from all my work last night or yesterday and my pain, I was so tired when I was trying to finish this up that I went to sleep till 4, and I got up again from 4 to 5, and I found this sax part, and I thought, this is so powerful, I've got to end this way, but we've run out of time. So we will begin this way next week, and it's really a powerful message that sax has for us there. But what we're left with is this story about Jacob is an individual story of a person wrestling with his conscience, with his identity of who he is meant to be in relationship with God, with his brother, with the world, his place in history. All of that internal turmoil of who he should be and how he should live is one that all of us deal with, greater and lesser degrees. And so, let us pray. But dear God, in that struggle with who we really are and who we're meant to be, we do trust that you do know us as we are, and you want us to be who we really are, your beloved children, the one who has a meaning and purpose for the life you have given us. So help us in our own faith journey to discover who we're meant to be and to feel blessed with that identity and blessed to become a blessing to others. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.